Yes, you like potato, and I like potato.
Well, in this case, we like Mānuka, they like Mānuka. It's been called a trans-Tasman tussle of extraordinary proportions. The Aussies have just won another round in the years-long battle over Mānuka honey.
It's now a brand we have to share with Australia.
It's a great result for Australia. Mānuka honey is a game changer for the industry.
Well, no, New Zealand is not ready to call the whole thing off.
Not at all. I think it's probably hardened the resolve of the industry to push on in some way, shape or form to distinguish New Zealand Mānuka honey.
This is obviously a setback, but we're not wavered in terms of our obligations and our responsibilities to ensuring that our taonga is protected.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, we look at what this means for a brand that is so precious to New Zealand, the next step in the fight to protect it, and keep to ourselves a market set to be worth more than $1 billion in the next few years. Farmers Weekly journalist Richard Rennie has been following the trademark battle since it started nearly 8 years ago, and every time New Zealand has lost in the EU, the UK, and now here.
The first move to trademark Mānuka honey, just the words as they are, was back in about 2015. And it's interesting when you read the latest ruling, which has basically refused that application here in 2023, the Commissioner refers to that initial attempts to register Mānuka honey and how it was initially turned down by the Intellectual Property Office on grounds that it lacked distinguishability or distinctiveness. And here we are almost 8 years later and it's happened again.
Noting while the Kiwi Group argued the Australian honey producers have jumped on the bandwagon that New Zealand created for Mānuka honey, it does not mean they should be able to monopolise the use of a wholly descriptive term.
So it had a bit of a rocky start to start with.
But what does that even mean, Richard, lacking in distinguishability or distinctiveness?
It seems that the Assistant Commissioner, Natasha Ali, in her ruling, which was pretty lengthy, it was almost 170 pages, felt that the claim to be of Mānuka honey, that phrase, is not distinct enough under New Zealand's Trademark Act to be quarantined or to be encircled under trademark protection. She pointed to the similarities between New Zealand and Australia Mānuka honey, and that in applying to have the trademark granted, that the applicants hadn't done enough to distinguish the differences between the New Zealand offering and offerings elsewhere, particularly Australia. But at the same time, the Commissioner was quite sympathetic. She acknowledged the law that she had to work under, the Trademark Act, really lacks this ability to acknowledge taonga value of something like Mānuka and its importance to iwi as a name and as an item, and seemed to be a level of almost, not frustration, but sympathy that, look, I'm sorry, but this is the tools that I have to work with. And that's been acknowledged by the Mānuka Charitable Trust too. The chairman, Peter Tippany, described the law being a bit of an ass.
Our primary goal is to protect the taonga that only comes from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's export theft. It'll have a detrimental effect.
But the thing about Mānuka honey, or Mānuka honey as the Australians call it, it's the same thing, isn't it? I mean, it tastes the same, it has the same special qualities.
Mānuka honey is taken as a health supplement and to treat colds and flu. It's highly valued in hospitals as a wound dressing, fighting drug-resistant infections. Kourtney Kardashian even suggests a Mānuka scrub might sweeten your love life.
It's like an old witchcraft thing to wash your whole body with it.
It depends who you talk to. Just talking to a beekeeper yesterday and honey producer, and he's adamant there is a distinct taste difference between the products. There's a lot more varieties of Mānuka in Australia that therefore influence the taste a lot more, and that there's no way in hell the two products are the same. But then, you've got the Australian Mānuka Honey Association saying that this was a sensible decision that paves the way for more global sales, and that they welcome the fact that the Commission has ruled the products are essentially the same.
Hopefully it'll get our friends in New Zealand to put down the guns.
The Australians' reaction is, well, of course it's very different because they've won. And, they've won every step of the way, haven't they?
Yes, they have. Yeah, and it's interesting in their statement, they make the comment, the fact that even authorities in New Zealand cannot find a way to support the trademark claims, we hope brings this dispute to an end.
And we can work together now that it's been lost in their own country of origin.
Obviously what they're saying is, well, look, if your own people can't grant you this protection, how the hell are you going to get it anywhere else?
We're not a threat to your industry. We're not that big, and hopefully we can work closer together.
I mean, there's a few interesting historical things around Mānuka honey. I mean, I put it to Karen Koss, the CEO of Apiculture New Zealand, that was New Zealand a day late and $1 short in trying to protect Mānuka? We found out about its antimicrobial properties and antibacterial properties and things. We started to find out about that in the 90s. Should we not have moved earlier and sooner to protect that once we knew about it and really lock it down earlier? A little bit like maybe we should have done with green kiwi fruit and Chileans back in the 70s and 80s.
Could you say that there's a similarity here with the kiwi fruit battle?
Yeah, I was thinking about that, and in some respects there is, Sharon. I mean, the backstory to Mānuka honey now, and something that's come up in our work with pieces of Done for Farmers Weekly, is claims of subterfuge and sabotage by New Zealanders in Australia in taking cuttings from the Leptosporum scorpium, the Mānuka plant, and transplanting them over to Australia. And I mean, it has these echoes of New Zealand green kiwi fruit going to Chile in suitcases for planting in the 70s and 80s. And it all sounds a little similar. We're relying on germplasm to create the product that creates the value. And it is often the problem with biological products like this, isn't it, that they can get out of the jar pretty quick.
It does feel like the industry in New Zealand just got onto it way too late. They must have seen the Australians using the term. I mean, the Australians claim that they've been using this term for decades.
It's an Australian word, and we have every right to use that. Mānuka, as we spell it, is not a Maori word. We don't use a macron.
I get a sense that the sector has, in a way, it may not have shot its entire foot, but it's shot part of it, in that they've had the debate within the honey sector about a commodity levy. The honey sector, to my knowledge, is the only primary sector group that doesn't have a commodity levy on its production, which can be used for research and development for pretty much whatever your members believe it should be best used on. And the honey industry had the chance to vote in a levy back in 2019. And I know even that's getting a little late in the scene for Mānuka honey, and that had the potential to raise, it was around about $2 million a year, I think. And it was sort of worked out at about 10 cents per kg of honey you produce. It wasn't a lot, at minimum 750 kg honey production to be required. And you do wonder if maybe you'd had a levy that would have given a bit more horsepower to the industry to push things along a bit harder and faster as well. And I think it's a real shame that they lack that, because there's huge potential in a portfolio of honey products, whether it's Rowa Rowa, Pahutakawa, Mānuka honey, and that is where the industry is wanting to go, to have this sort of portfolio of offerings, a little bit like the wine industry has with Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc or Otago Pinot or whatever. And this does sort of make it harder, I think, to advance that when you're still caught up in your hero product, if you like, or trying to define your hero product.
But another interesting thing that the Australians are kind of latching on to, that there are other beekeepers and industry members out there who actually want to work more collaboratively with the Australian industry.
We can't meet world demand between New Zealand and Australia. Anytime I talk to New Zealand beekeepers, the overwhelming response is, why are we fighting?
Are you hearing anything like that?
No, look, I haven't heard it, but I've only spoken to a couple of producers who one said to me, imagine the uproar if we called power abalone. He said too that it's a little bit like the evolution of the term jandals. He said jandals were created by a company, but the term was adopted so quickly to describe a rubber sandal that it kind of got into the lexicon and the language very quickly. And this is kind of what the Commissioner was saying about Mānuka honey. It got into our language quite quickly as just a term, and therefore hard to distinguish as a distinct term. And she basically said you can't blame the Australians for picking up on that relatively quickly. They could see the value in it. But like the Kiwi honey producer said to me, he said, but using the jandals analogy, he said, but what the Aussies have done is they've taken a leather sandal and they're claiming it's a jandal, and it's not the same thing. So trans-Tasman analogy, yeah.
Yes, actually I saw a story about it on Australian television where they managed to bring in the underarm bowl.
New Zealand's only hope now is a 6 off the last ball for a tie.
But in the honey war, New Zealand has struck out everywhere.
They're going to bowl an underarm. We haven't believed it. That's a disappointing finish.
Well, it's a classic opening, isn't it? What could they take? The Pavlova, Far Lap and Crowded House. Well, I've never been a fan of Pav, but, you know, we should claim Crowded House and Far Lap, I think, and maybe Mānuka honey yet too.
So could the next step in the tug-of-war over Mānuka be in geographical indications legislation? Think name-protected things like champagne, balsamica and our own Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. It means you can only call them that if they come from the region where they were originally made. It came up in our trade deal with the EU.
The good stuff is that they're only going for feta at the moment, so as a naming GI, geographical indication. So they've left Gouda, Gruyere, halloumi, mozzarella and parmesan all alone to a certain degree.
Let's hear more from a lawyer who is part of the battle to protect taonga Māori.
Kia ora, my name is Lanao Tawhiri-Huria, the Tumu Whakahaere or managing partner at Kāhui Legal.
This decision, how did you feel when you heard it?
Pretty gutted, actually, to be honest. I thought there was an opportunity here to adopt a different perspective when interpreting our Trademarks Act, and the Assistant Commissioner didn't take that approach here.
How much of a setback is this in terms of the fight to protect Māori words?
Obviously the decision is a huge setback to the aspirations of the Mānuka Charitable Trust in terms of protecting the mana and mauri of our taonga species. What it does confirm is that the intellectual property system and regime is not designed to protect our taonga. That is a fact that is well known both here in New Zealand and around the world. What it also reaffirms is that we do need other regimes and structures to help protect our taonga species, and the government needs to take urgent action to address that.
In what way? Can you explain that further? I mean, if this regime isn't designed to protect our taonga, then what do we need?
Then we need other structures, other regimes. The original claimants from the Y262 claim.
Y262 was a Waitangi Tribunal claim about the recognition of rights around traditional Māori knowledge and customs.
They proposed a tikanga-based framework to protect our taonga. The claimants' descendants have formed Te Taumata Whakapumo, and they are exploring the establishment of a taonga framework. Proposals have been shared in the past around we need a Mātauranga Māori Commission to, look after our Mātauranga Māori. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which talks about recognising Indigenous rights and intellectual property. The World Intellectual Property Organisation is working on a treaty to recognise these rights. So these regimes are known. They have been talked about for many years, and we need them. Otherwise, our taonga are going to be appropriated, and we are going to continue to have other taonga species appropriated by interests internationally.
What else is at risk here? Does this have ramifications for other cases of intellectual property protection?
It does. All our native flora and fauna are at risk now because of this decision. There are a lot of things that could have been done differently along the way. If we think back to the original research that, sort of kick-started the Mānuka industry, that research was done based on mātauranga Māori, but there was no recognition of the rights of Māori to that mātauranga Māori. That science and research was not done in partnership with Māori. And so therefore, when it was released, there was no controls on who could use it. Consequently, we've seen because of the fact that Leptospermum scoparium grows in Australia, they've adopted Mānuka for their honey from that plant that's grown in Australia. The Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment is currently reviewing the research, science and innovation sector and hoping to address some of these concerns, but it's all moving very slowly and we need to see improvement.
What does it say about the fight to protect other Māori words?
I think it does highlight that our kupu are at risk. One of the issues that was discussed in the decision refers a lot to the definition of the word Mānuka in a number of dictionaries around the world, in English dictionaries. And, the interpretation of that word based on those definitions is quite critical in this decision because the Assistant Commissioner does rely on those definitions. And yet those definitions, there's no input again from Māori into those definitions. There's no consideration of what it means to borrow words from another language and the negative impacts that it has on those words. What the Commissioner says, they become borrowed words, they become loaned words, and they form part of the English vernacular. But that's not consistent with how Māori or Indigenous people around the world, consider their language or consider their kupu. They're not considered just part of the vernacular and, not worthy of protection. And I also think that view is not consistent with a correct interpretation of Te Ture mo te reo Māori, which talks about our reo having taonga status and recognising, that Mānuka is a kupu from our reo, and so therefore demands recognition as a taonga status. And so then, therefore, to conclude that it is just part of the English language vernacular is incorrect and inappropriate.
It's been a pretty costly process, nearly 8 years, this battle, to fight it in various jurisdictions. I'm just wondering what is next. You're saying that you're reviewing the decision. Are there any other avenues for this fight?
Yeah, there are definitely other avenues. I mean, we could consider refiling the trademark application, like I said, with a macron over the letter A and see if that makes a difference. We could explore the area of geographical indications, which is an area that we can't yet explore in New Zealand because our legislation in New Zealand only extends to wines and spirits. That is going to change fairly soon once we ratify all the requirements under our free trade agreements with the UK and EU. So that is another avenue, but that's a few years away yet. The other avenue is a bespoke sui generis piece of legislation that would assist in the protection of our taonga, especially here in Aotearoa. If we don't have protection here, it makes it so much more difficult to protect internationally. The government really needs to explore protection for our taonga here in our country so that can help with the misuse and appropriation that we are seeing internationally.
Because does this decision mean that we'll now be buying Mānuka honey in New Zealand that's made in Australia?
No, it won't, because our current import regulations don't allow the importation of honey into Aotearoa New Zealand, the biosecurity requirements. So we won't see that available in New Zealand immediately. Having said that, those settings could change at any time. So that could be a possibility at a future date. You know, the Mānuka honey industry is a huge industry for this country, and that's based on significant international sales. If the market becomes flooded with honeys claiming the same characteristics as our honey internationally, then that's going to have a negative impact on that industry.
What's the state of the honey industry at the moment? It's very boom-bust, isn't it?
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, I went to my first New Zealand beekeepers conference back in 2006. It was always a very low-key affair, you know, maybe held at a local hotel somewhere with not much rah. And it was a smack in the face to turn up in 2017 to Rotorua Beekeepers Conference, and it was huge. It was like a mini Mystery Creek. There was all sorts of people selling gear to beekeepers who are generally pretty retiring, sort of quiet, considered kind of people. And suddenly the industry had felt it had struck gold with Mānuka honey. You know, this was 2017, and a conference had gone nuts, and it must have only been in 2 or 3 short years to get to this very sort of expansive conference offering all sorts of goodies for beekeepers to buy, from 4-wheel drive trucks to cranes, you name it. And that was Mānuka honey, sort of going from zero to hero in quite a short time. And there was a big pile on into the industry, to the point where Dr. Mark Goodwin, one of our most eminent bee experts, saying that New Zealand was actually overstocked for hives. One stage we had more hives than Australia. I think it was about almost 1 million hives. That had jumped up. It had almost doubled in only 6 or 7 years, an incredible amount. So we're essentially overstocking our landscape with hives to try and suck as much Mānuka in as we could, because that was where the returns were. Yet here we are now. There is vast amounts of non-Mānuka honey struggling to be sold on a global market that's pretty full. And I hear stories of drums of honey in warehouses around central North Island looking for a home.
But it's not Mānuka honey.
No, not always. Although there have been claims that Mānuka has got harder to sell, but I haven't. Most people I talk to say that no, the quality Mānuka honey still has a very ready market. I think it had almost $300 million worth of export sales last year. I think the year before.
That's it for today. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. The Detail is supported by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. This episode was engineered by William Saunders. Our producers are Sarah Robson and Bonnie Harrison. And thanks to Linnell Tuffrey-Huria and Richard Rennie. Mā te wā.